What did Afghanistan look like 6 months, give or take, before the withdrawal?
Yeah. So, I mean, in 2020, in Afghanistan, certainly wasn't an ideal situation. The Doha Agreement that had been struck between the United States and the Taliban to the exclusion of the Afghan government um, was a deeply flawed agreement. It was Zalmay Khalilzad, who had been selected by Trump to handle the negotiations with the Taliban. And the Doha Agreement gave the Taliban, I think, more than they ever really expected the United States would have given them. So the Doha Agreement was deeply flawed agreement. There were conditions in the Doha Agreement that the Taliban was refusing to follow. They didn't follow a single condition in the Doha Agreement. That includes, in the lead up to the withdrawal, they continued to carry out some attacks against U.S. and NATO bases. They had cut those down a bit, but they did still continue to carry those out, which was a violation of the Doha Agreement. They refused to ever cut their ties with Al Qaeda, that alliance that had existed when the Taliban was shielding them before 9/11. Taliban refused to hand over Osama bin Laden and other Al Qaeda leaders after 9/11, and they protected them for 2 decades. And they were still protecting them in the lead up to the withdrawal. In terms of where things stood on the battlefield, um, you had probably what you could call a stalemate to a large extent. The Afghan government, the Afghan Republic, the Afghan military were in a position with US and NATO support where the Taliban was never going to be able to take over the country. That was not going to happen as long as the Afghan military had at least some U.S. support. The Taliban was never going to win. It just wasn't going to happen. One example of that is even after the Doha Agreement, and as the U.S. under the Trump administration continued to draw down forces, but never went to zero, but did reduce forces, the Taliban actually sought to carry out a really significant military offensive in and around October 2020 in Helmand province. And they actually took over, big parts of the province and everything like that. But with U.S. backing, the Afghan military was able to go in there and drive them out, really like crush the Taliban. So the Taliban was showing that it could carry out big operations, but it couldn't sustain anything significant into the provincial capitals, certainly not towards Kabul. So the situation was precarious, but there was no way that the Afghan military was going to lose the Taliban as long as the U.S. was giving them, the limited support we were. 2,500 troops on the ground, contractor support for their aviation, logistics, equipment, all of that. So it was kind of something of a stalemate. But the United States, what we were getting out of it is Taliban was never going to take over. We had significant counterterrorism platforms that were able to use in Afghanistan to keep going after Al Qaeda and ISIS-K, which had grown fairly strong over the years. And then, of course, Bagram Air Base was the biggest and most significant base in the region. It's less than an hour's drive from Kabul, the capital city of Afghanistan. Really strategically important base, not just in Afghanistan, but also regionally. That base gave us the ability to monitor the broader region, Pakistan, China. Just to the people don't think about it, but China actually does border Afghanistan, and in that western part of China, while it's not as populated as the eastern part of China, they do some interesting things over there. That's where they are carrying out their oppression and genocide against the Uyghurs. They also do nuclear weapons research, development, stuff like that in the West a little bit as well. So Bagram gave us that ability. So anyway, the long story short is that in the lead up to the withdrawal, the final days of the Trump administration, Trump wanted to go to zero. But his military commanders told him this would be a disaster and this would be on you if you did that. And so he did not do that. He kept fluctuating between 2,500 and 3,500 troops last in Afghanistan when Biden took over. And that's kind of what the state of play was when Biden took office.
It's a great synopsis, man. And I don't want to go too far back in history because I know we're here to talk about the fall and the disastrous withdrawal that came after it.
Yeah.
But where do you think the turning point was on this 20-year operation? Because I've got a theory, and I'm curious to hear if you think it's legit. But between you and I mean, when we were reporters together, we've been following Afghanistan in one way, shape, or form our entire careers, more or less, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had the opportunity, I think, and we're fortunate to look into this at a very ingrained level. I mean, I remember reading the Special Investigator General on Reconstruction's reports on how we're spending hundreds of millions on, highways to nowhere and things like that. It seemed like for a long time, things were going to go downhill. I have a theory, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, that the turning point was Tora Bora in late 2001, when we had the ability and most likely the opportunity to kill or capture bin Laden in the mountains along the region with Pakistan. But due to what seems like politics, we chose not to surround his retreat area on the Pakistan side. Now, the irony, of course, being that 11 years later, we went farther into Pakistan to eventually take him out.
Yep.
And meanwhile, he was able to be this Robin Hood character for another 11 years, causing us all kinds of problems in the region. That's my theory on where things change, because you could obviously see a more focus on reconstruction and a total redesign of the government in the country. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where you think the turning point was.
So I think that there were a lot of different moments where we made huge mistakes that sent things towards a negative trajectory. I don't think it's hard to come up with like one specific thing. If we had done this one thing right, that everything would have gone well, because we made so many mistakes here. So there are a lot of fundamental problems, I think. Obviously, what you said about Tora Bora, we didn't go into Afghanistan with the number and scale of forces that we should have. We really took a light approach, a very impressive special operations and CIA approach, in coordination with the Northern Alliance, and other Afghans, to roll up the Taliban pretty quickly, kick them out of power pretty quickly. But we didn't deal a death blow to the Taliban, and we didn't deal a death blow to Al Qaeda. I don't want to make it seem like there were no successes in that first stage, because we did capture, a number of Al Qaeda. We did capture and kill a number of Al Qaeda, capture and kill a number of Taliban, but the Taliban leadership was largely able to escape. Osama bin Laden and his inner circle was largely able to escape. And so that put us immediately in a negative position. I think that the focus on America turning its attention immediately to Iraq took our focus away from what we should have been doing in Afghanistan. And our attention didn't really start to turn back to Afghanistan until a few years into the war in Iraq. And then you had Obama's presidency and then Trump taking over. But there were significant mistakes made throughout there. I think a big strategic problem was that in some ways we were too small and in some ways we were too big, in terms of what we wanted to accomplish there. So the ways I think that we were too big is there was too much of a focus on sort of the quote unquote nation building aspect of things, and trying to hinge it all on that. But we were, I think, and I thought this forever, is that we were too small in our thinking about what we wanted to do in terms of our enemies in Afghanistan. So the the goal was never fully accomplished in terms of eliminating the Al Qaeda threat in even just in Afghanistan. And the U.S. government, the military, the intelligence community would always be talking about how there's, maybe just 100 or so Al Qaeda left in Afghanistan, 200 Al Qaeda left in Afghanistan. They would say this for years and years and years and years. And for years and years and years and years and years, the United States, NATO, and our Afghan allies would kill dozens and hundreds of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, but somehow the number always stayed the same. So I don't think that the US was ever honest about the intransigence of just the Al Qaeda problem in Afghanistan. And then you add on to that the United States never knew what to do about the Taliban. If the goal was not to totally defeat the Taliban, then you were never going to be able to fully eliminate Al Qaeda, because the Taliban was shielding, protecting Al Qaeda before 9/11 and for 20 years after. If you weren't willing to fully deal with the Taliban problem, then you weren't going to be able to deal with the Al Qaeda problem. And then, of course, on top of that, the United States never figured out how to deal with the Pakistan problem, never figured it out. Taliban and Al Qaeda were always able to have safe haven in Pakistan, and that safe haven was never eliminated. You were never going to be able to get to what you would consider a true win if you didn't deal with that. So those are fundamental things to not get, like to not, and on top of this, I don't think that the United States ever fully understood the Taliban's determination to hang on and win totally, and to never be willing to give up that alliance with Al Qaeda. If they'd been willing to cast Al Qaeda to the side, I think that it would have made it easier for them to get more international legitimacy and get a seat at the table and win that way. But they were not willing to win by throwing Al Qaeda under the bus. And you can see it today with the Taliban back in charge. The Al Qaeda threat remains. Some Al Qaeda members are in the Taliban government. These are basically like dual-hatted Taliban Al Qaeda guys. You've got the new head of Al Qaeda, Saif al-Adil, calling on foreign fighters to go to Afghanistan, calling on Al Qaeda fighters to go to Afghanistan to train, to continue the jihad. So the United States never understood that, never figured it out. And so winning was always going to be really, really hard.
It seems to me that, just growing up and then watching the GWAT, throughout our formative years, and then reporting on the tail end of it, it always seemed to me that the one advantage the other side had, whether that was Al Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, they could always play the long game. They could always wait us out. And I don't know if that's a product of our short-term thinking as a country. I don't know if it's a product of our politics and the 4-year cycles that we kind of think in. But I feel, and please let me know what you think on this too. It seems to me like this is our biggest weakness and everybody knows it except us.
Yeah. Well, the Taliban had this saying, and it is a real saying that they would tell people. They would say, "You have all the watches, but we have all the time." Like that was what the Taliban was willing to shield Al Qaeda in the 90s as Al Qaeda was carrying out these terrorist attacks around the world, bombing our embassies, bombing the USS Cole, and then World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And the Taliban knew that if they kept letting Al Qaeda do this, eventually, hell would rain down on the Taliban too. But they were willing to do it, and they were not willing to stave off a U.S. invasion by handing over Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda leadership, they very well may have been able to stave off the invasion if they had done that. And they weren't willing to do that. They were willing to have bombs dropped on them, get crushed, get killed, get thrown out of power, and have to hide up in the mountains in the hinterlands for 20 years rather than break that alliance with Al Qaeda. They were never willing to do it. They were never going to be willing to break that alliance. And that's something that the United States never fully comprehended. But the timetable aspect of these things, if you think back about, troop surges and troop withdrawals in Afghanistan, President Obama, kind of when he ran for president in 08, and part of how he won was sort of this theme that Iraq was the bad war, Afghanistan is the good war. We're going to get out of Iraq and we're going to do a surge in Afghanistan. That's kind of how he fundamentally did it. Now, and we can debate the merits of the war in Iraq. Problematic and complicated to say the least. But once the war was being fought and you saw Al Qaeda really try to make a stand in Iraq, it became a different sort of war. You couldn't let Al Qaeda win in Iraq. And so the war transformed from what it was into something different. And obviously when the United States left Iraq, what it enabled was the rise of what had been an offshoot of Al Qaeda, but then became ISIS, the Islamic State, and you saw them grow in strength in Syria and in Iraq and take over huge parts of it, set up their caliphate, and do all the horrific things they did. And then, we had to deal with that. But in Afghanistan, President Obama did send a huge number of U.S. forces into Afghanistan, but he did it immediately announcing the timeline for when those troops would be coming home. And so, while that large U.S. force was there, they did kill a ton of Taliban, a lot of Al Qaeda, and did clear a lot of areas and all of this, good stuff. It was good, but with the timetable, with Taliban knowing that all they had to do was survive, and that huge U.S. force would go back down again. That's what they did, and they survived that. Now that did weaken them. And then in the early years of the Trump administration, the first year or two, the U.S. really did take the fight to the Taliban again, and really did hurt them. But the Taliban knew that as long as they held on, they'd probably be able to wait the United States out. And that's what they were able to do with getting a really good deal for them in the Doha deal in February 2020, and then being given an absolute gift in April 2021 when President Biden made that total withdrawal announcement. That is what they were waiting for. They were waiting for that, and they began to execute on their plan within weeks. And it culminated within months. So they were ready. They were ready, and that decision that President Biden made was a big mistake, and the Taliban had their plan ready to go, and they executed it pretty well.
Yeah, it's incredible to me, like the long-term thinking that was at play here was remarkable. And so yeah, let's fast forward. I'm glad you brought that up. So we got Doha, Trump leaves the White House. Biden obviously comes in with what seems like a mandate, self-imposed, I would guess,
Yep.
or I would say. And the decision is made, and it just seems like we'd been telegraphing since, I would say, Obama, right? I mean, they were ready, as you noted. So we come to like, I guess, the D-Day, right? The decision is made. Folks are going to start evacuating. That's the plan. Bring us into that a little bit, because I know you've written and researched this a great deal. Those couple months before the Abbey Gate bombing in the final days, what was going on? What did that look like?
Yeah. So look, when President Biden took office, Uh, he ditched a lot of Trump policies, and a ton of Trump personnel. Um, he could have torn up the Doha Agreement because the Taliban was violating every single piece of it, but he didn't. And he could have gotten rid of Zal Khalilzad, the U.S.'s main negotiator with the Taliban, but he kept him on, with the Biden administration actually praising the vital work that he was doing. And I would argue that Zal Khalilzad's role in 2021 was just as significant as it was in 2020, because as the U.S. military left, a lot of the energy and focus then went to Doha and what negotiation could be, put together with the Taliban in 2021. So President Biden takes office, and you'll remember that he was very unhappy as vice president about Obama's Afghanistan policy. And he had a huge chip on his shoulder related to the military and the generals, who largely rejected him and shoved him aside when he was vice president. So when he became president, this is how he was going to make his mark on the war in Afghanistan. And he would not listen to outside voices outside the government, because you didn't have to be a genius to know that if you pull the remaining U.S. forces and the contractors and the logistics and the advisors and everything that the Afghan military is relying on, the Afghan Air Force is relying on to function, you don't have to be a genius to know that that's going to be really bad and things will go south quickly. But he wouldn't listen to anyone outside. He wouldn't listen to anybody inside his administration that told him this would be a bad idea. Milley and McKenzie, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the commander of CENTCOM, while it's my assessment that they made significant mistakes of their own in 2021, they did tell President Biden that going to zero would be a very, very, very bad idea. And President Biden did it anyway. And what the U.S. withdrawal meant was, it wasn't just U.S. forces leaving. It was also NATO forces leaving. NATO actually, in 2021, before the withdrawal began, had a significantly larger presence actually than the U.S. did. And a lot of our NATO allies were willing to continue to stick it out. Now, they could not do that without the U.S. being there. So if the U.S. stayed, then our NATO allies would have stayed in, fairly important numbers. But if the U.S. left, NATO was gone as well. There was no way that NATO was going to stay. And members of NATO expressed their views to Biden and to Blinken that the U.S. should stick it out. And that was rejected. So the U.S. leaving meant NATO leaving, meant many thousands of contractors leaving, which meant all of the contractors who were, especially the ones who were keeping the Afghan Air Force flying, which was their huge advantage over the Taliban. Those contractors had to leave. All of our advisors had to leave. The ISR that we were supplying was pretty much gone. And our air support that we were providing was pretty much leaving as well. And so this Afghan military that we had built around, designed by design, built around American support, now had that backbone ripped out of it. And the Taliban, in the meantime, had a pretty savvy military strategy ready to go, and they executed on it pretty quickly. That Taliban offensive really started in May.
Yeah.
So President Biden made his go to zero announcement in April, and Taliban was off to the races in May.
Dude, I remember I was in the Trump admin, as you might remember, that last year. So I was not involved in DOD, not involved in State Department, but was watching pretty closely the events of Doha. And of course, then we see the election and just the announcement. I remember watching, Bill Roggio over at FDD.
Of course.
Had that great map he was updating with the districts. And my God, man, I remember Bill screaming to the top of his lungs on Twitter, anyone who report with him, about how the districts are being lost in rapid fashion. And God bless him, he did the Lord's work, but nobody was paying attention. It was always being downplayed. It was media was always down. Oh no, 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 it's not that bad. Come on, Bill. You've been a doomsayer for years on this stuff, and it's kind of sad that in a way he was correct. You know what I mean? Because you never want to be correct on something that is so disastrous. But at the same time, I'm glad he was, because anyone who was paying attention knew exactly what was going on.
So I'm friends with Bill. He was spot on in 2021. And so just one quick diversion is that, the name of his outlet is the Long War Journal, right? And he made that point, I think, purposefully, that this was going to be a long war if you wanted to win it. So, and that was never the mentality that the US had. So that was always a problem. So, but anyway, so yes, Bill and the Long War Journal were totally right in 2021, tracking that the swiftness of the Taliban advance. And you can see it in the Long War Journal's maps starting in May. So starting in May, you see the Taliban immediately start to take advantage of that go to zero order and the quick removal of US troops. So April, President Biden makes his go to zero announcement. And by May, the Taliban is beginning to conduct what would be its offensive that culminated in taking Kabul. You see it accelerate even more in June. You see it accelerate even more in July. And then you see it accelerate even more in August. Now, while the Long War Journal was spot on about the swiftness of the Taliban advance, this goes back to one of my problems with Chairman Milley. Milley testified in front of Congress in the summer of 2021 about the state of play with the Taliban's control of districts in Afghanistan. And he was completely wrong. He was days, weeks behind. The Taliban advance had gone well beyond what Milley seemed to be aware of. Now, was Milley shading the truth on behalf of the Biden administration to make this seem like it wasn't as bad as it really was? Or was he just completely unaware as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about what was going on? Either way, let's say it's not good to be wrong about something like that. So Milley got the speed of the Taliban advances wrong, but he also got the size of the Afghan forces wrong. So he was talking in the summer of 2021 about the combined strength of the Afghan military and police. He was claiming that there was 325,000 to 350,000 strong. Now, anybody who was following Afghanistan, the war there, knew that was never true. The Afghan military and police were never 350,000 strong. They certainly were not that strong in the summer of 2021, in the midst of the U.S. troop withdrawal, the Taliban military campaign. You had significant casualties, significant deaths among the Afghan military. You had capitulations, desertions, surrender, captures. You had guys who, because they had lost all of the outside support that the Afghan military needed, you just had people out on posts who didn't have ammunition anymore, didn't have food anymore, didn't have water anymore. So the Afghan military and police were significantly smaller than 350,000. They were significantly smaller than 300,000, which is the number that President Biden and a lot of his inner circle kept using. The numbers were much smaller than that. So you had Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, getting the speed of the Taliban advance wrong and getting the size and strength of the Afghan military wrong. And look, I didn't serve. I'm not a military expert, but when you're trying to understand the like basic fundamentals of what's going to happen, on the battlefield, understanding your enemy and understanding your ally and what they're able to bring forward is like pretty much the most fundamental thing. And Milley was either misleading on behalf of the Biden administration or was just completely out to lunch. Either one is very bad, but it helps show how the US government and the Biden administration missed this so badly. The military's top commander didn't see it, could not see it. And the US intelligence community missed it as well. But then you had outside people like the Longmore Journal and Bill Roggio tracking this pretty accurately and predicting that, the Afghan government would be lucky to survive the summer. How is it that the Longmore Journal and FDD were nailing this, but the entire U.S. government, from the military, intelligence community, State Department, couldn't see it, see it or refused to see it? I mean, I think that it was a mixture of both. There was a refusal to see what was going on, but they also really just fundamentally did not understand the dynamics in Afghanistan. They didn't get it. And 2021 and what went wrong there was just such a perfect crystallization of how the U.S. for 20 years had not understood the dynamics in Afghanistan, had not understood the Taliban's motivations and determination. And we paid the price for it in 2021.
Yeah. Oh, dude, totally. So that actually is a good segue into, the actual withdrawal itself. So, and Abbey Gate, of course, which I think as of this recording was last week was the anniversary, if I'm not mistaken.
August 26, 2021.
Yeah.
So we just got
this week.
Yeah.
Man,
we just got to 3 years. Yep.
Yeah. So you had your journalism career. You and was James, right? You guys did the co-author of the book.
Yep.
You eventually, I'm guessing because of all the great work from the book, get picked up by the House Foreign Affairs Committee to investigate this. Which by the way, and I know you're not, you're not one for aggrandizement and glory. You're a humble guy, but I have to tell you, man, I had a lot of respect for you caring so much about this issue that you put your very, very successful journalism career on hold to go and do this. I think one thing I tried to make clear, because I know you got a lot of hate when you publicly resigned from some trolls. I will say this. Anyone who's doubting your sincerity who's listening, I think should keep in mind that you didn't do this because it was going to be good for your prospects. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like you did this because you believed in it. I remember us talking and having those discussions years ago. And I think anyone who doubts your sincerity should really take a long, hard look at themselves first and foremost. So I just want to get that out of the way. But one thing that I've always questioned, and I wonder if, when you were engaged in the investigation for this, why the 9/11 date announcement, man? Like what the hell was anybody thinking there? Because I'm not a military expert either, but I am a communications expert. And I can tell you that was probably one of the most, just from a comms perspective, a PR perspective, one of the most boneheaded and ignorant things I have ever seen a government official do. So was there any clarity on why that was chosen? Because if I'm the Taliban and I'm seeing that, I'm thinking to myself, well, that's the day I'm going to throw everything I've got at them. It's
Yep.
What was the reasoning?
So that question is a very good question. And it is one that I tried to get answered while on the committee. Milley and McKenzie basically said they don't know why it was picked. Jen Psaki basically said she didn't know why it was picked. This was President Biden and what he wanted. And my view on why he picked that date is he wanted to make his mark on the war in Afghanistan. He had been ignored as vice president. He's president now. This is how he's going to make his mark. And how he's going to make his mark on the whole thing is total withdrawal, and use the 20th anniversary as a way to sort of say, because of me, we are closing the chapter on the global war on terrorism. We're closing the chapter on the war in Afghanistan. That's what he wanted to do. What he guaranteed was that on that 20th anniversary of 9/11, the Taliban, the group that had shielded and protected Al-Qaeda before 9/11 and for 20 years after 9/11, that group, the Taliban, was now back in charge of Afghanistan. By picking that date, that's what he guaranteed. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. And that was a choice that President Biden, I think, himself made.
I just, I think of all the things in this saga. That's the one that bothers me one of the most. The
It's horrible.
second, yeah, it was just, it's such an unforced error and a real, just foolish policy decision. Which I think this is, yeah. So this brings me to my next obvious one that was the other disappointing factor here was, of course, the Abbey Gate bombing and the loss of the 13 service members. And I don't even remember how many civilians, but I do recall it being very, very large number. Um, can you diagnose what happened there, or give us kind of an autopsy of what went wrong and what you discovered in your time, both obviously writing your book and engaged with investigation with the committee?
Yeah. So part of the problem here was the decision to close Bagram, to abandon Bagram in early July 2021. So Bagram was sort of our last major base that the U.S. military still had following Biden's go to zero order.
Can you tell
And
folks a little bit about what Bagram is and why it was important, just for those who
yeah,
might not be?
yeah. So Bagram Air Base is a very, very, very large air base, less than an hour's drive from the capital of Kabul. And for a long time during the war in Afghanistan, it was sort of the nerve center of the U.S. military's operations in Afghanistan. Well, very, very, very important strategic base. And because of Biden's go to zero order, eventually Bagram was going to have to be closed. Now, the dispute that I think is still up in the air, that the committee never properly got answers on or investigated, is whether Bagram could have been kept open longer. Because there are reports that Jake Sullivan tried to convince Milley and McKenzie to keep Bagram open longer. And that Milley and McKenzie said, we got to close it now. Speed is safety. That was the mantra of the military during the retrograde. And so Bagram was closed in early July. That was sort of the U.S. military's last foothold outside of HKIA. Why that's important? There's a lot of reasons why it's important. We're giving up a strategic air base for the region that we could have monitored threats like Pakistan, China, an extremely helpful platform for conducting counterterrorism against Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, very helpful for conducting strikes against the Taliban. If we had held on to Bagram, there is essentially no way that the Taliban would have been able to advance to Kabul the way that they did. It just wouldn't have happened. But there's also a huge prison at Bagram called Parwan. And in that prison were, at the time, in the summer of 2021, thousands of Taliban fighters, dozens of Al-Qaeda terrorists, and what's believed to be well over 1,000 ISIS-K terrorists as well. And among those was a guy named Abdul Rahman al-Laghri, member of ISIS-K, who would go on to become the Abbey Gate bomber. So when the Taliban took Bagram around August 15th, the first thing that they did was throw open the doors to Parwan prison and freed their fellow Taliban fighters, freed their Al-Qaeda allies, but also freed well over 1,000 ISIS-K terrorists, who nominally are their mortal enemies. Taliban and ISIS-K fight each other in Afghanistan. They fought each other for years, but there is this relationship, sort of an under-talked about, complicated relationship between the Haqqani Taliban and ISIS-K, where the Haqqani Taliban have a history of helping to facilitate ISIS-K attacks, especially in Kabul. So anyway, giving up Bagram was very bad for a lot of those reasons. Some of them were obvious at the time. Some of them should have been predictable, but became clear why it was so bad. So McKenzie goes to Doha, and he's there on August 15th, and he meets with the Taliban's leadership. Their leader there in Doha was Mullah Baradar. And McKenzie shows up with a couple of already extremely outdated maps, telling the Taliban, hey, if you come in within this this radius and this radius around Kabul, we're going to like destroy you. And the Taliban informs him, well, we're already inside all of that. We're at the gates of Kabul. Like we're on the verge of taking Kabul. We can take it. But the Taliban leader there, Baradar, makes an offer to the U.S. What I think was sort of their last ditch effort to get a little bit of tiny sliver of international goodwill or legitimacy or whatever they were seeking, because they knew they were now going to get Kabul as well. But Baradar offered to keep the Taliban out of Kabul and offered to allow the U.S. military to pour in whatever U.S. forces they wanted to pour into Kabul, secure the city. The U.S. could secure the city. The Taliban would stay out, and the U.S. could carry out its evacuation. By all accounts, including from General McKenzie himself, he turned that offer down on the spot. And the committee, unfortunately, that I worked for kind of failed to really drill him on that and really figure out did he really never run that up the chain? Or did he really turn that down on the spot? And why would he do such thing? But it seems like he really did turn it down on the spot, which meant that the Taliban had a green light to go into Kabul. And they did in force. And so the U.S. was forced to conduct an evacuation where all that the United States controlled was a very small secret CIA base in Kabul called Eagle Base and Kabul Airport. And outside of that, the Taliban controlled everything. And the U.S. was forced to rely on the Taliban to provide security outside Kabul Airport. The Taliban had set up all around the airport. So we had to rely on them to provide security. We also had to rely on them to allow Americans and our Afghan allies to get through. This is problematic, obviously, for a lot of pretty obvious reasons. There were numerous times when the U.S. military asked the Taliban to search or raid an ISIS-K location in Kabul during the evacuation, and the Taliban would say no. Okay, the Taliban would say no. Now, it's not really surprising to me that the Taliban would say no, but it does complicate things when you're relying on them to provide security against ISIS-K, and they won't go and, search the hotel that ISIS-K might be at or search the mosque that ISIS-K might be staging at. Big problem. But of course, this is the Taliban that freed, over 1,000 ISIS-K prisoners from Bagram as one of their first acts in taking power at Bagram. So all of this is very bad. You had mass chaos at the airport. You had the Taliban turning Americans away. You had the Taliban beating up Americans. You had the Taliban beating up Afghans and killing Afghans. And the more that I learn about that aspect of it from people who are on the ground, it really does seem like a fairly significant number of Afghans, likely including Afghan allies, were executed by the Taliban outside of Kabul airport, sometimes within view of the U.S. service members and Marines who were manning the gates and manning the towers there. And they were not allowed to do anything about that. The Taliban had been removed from the ROEs unless the Taliban posed a direct and immediate threat to the U.S. service members themselves. But the Taliban, the U.S. troops on the ground there, the Army guys, the Marines, they were not allowed to intervene when the Taliban was turning people away or beating people up or killing them. So that paints a picture of why this was so dangerous, and for why it was so clear that this could so easily go wrong. And it did, with the Abbey Gate attack. Abdul Rahman al-Agri, who'd been freed from Bagram by the Taliban just 11 days before, was able to carry out a successful attack. He killed 13 Americans, 11 Marines, one Navy officer, and one Army officer. He also wounded dozens of U.S. service members. I think that the number is 45 were wounded, including you had, you know, you had you had a Marine lose limbs. You had another female service officer paralyzed in the attack, and then other, pretty serious wounds, some of them life altering as well. And you had well over 100 Afghans were also killed in the blast. Something like 170, 200 Afghans died as a result of the Abbey Gate attack as well. It was predictable that something like that would happen. And in my view, and maybe we can get into this just a little bit, CENTCOM investigated this and has always stood by its conclusion that the Abbey Gate attack was not preventable. And in my view, I think that it at least potentially was. If the Taliban had done what we asked them to do, we asked them to raid those ISIS-K locations, there may not have been an Abbey Gate attack, potentially. If the Abbey Gate bomber had been sitting behind bars in Bagram rather than out there roaming around, picking up a suicide vest and going off on his mission, it wouldn't have happened. The U.S. did not carry out any airstrikes against ISIS-K during the evacuation until after the Abbey Gate bombing. And in my view, it remains an open question, but there is indication, there is indication and witness testimony that there potentially could have been an airstrike or airstrikes carried out against ISIS-K before the Abbey Gate bombing instead of after it. So there remain open questions in this regard. But it is my view that I'm really looking at this, that the Abbey Gate attack was at least potentially preventable. And I would like Congress to press CENTCOM on it more firmly. And I would like CENTCOM to be more honest about this rather than trying to downplay it or whitewash it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because I remember when you got picked up to investigate this, and it gave me a lot of confidence that they were taking this very seriously, because I know you'd done your book. I knew that you'd been talking to the right people. And so I think a lot of us, in the ads community, writing, community, whatever you want to call it, I think a lot of us were really confident that this was going to be a good thing. And maybe we're going to get some justice on this. What I guess I don't understand as someone who looks on it from the outside is why there hasn't been more revealed to the public, and why it just doesn't feel like, your efforts notwithstanding, it doesn't feel like decisions were made at the committee level to really engage in this to an aggressive standpoint.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was the case? Was it just decisions at the top? Was it the fact that you couldn't get the right people speaking? I mean, what was your sense of that?
Yeah. So it's extremely disappointing for me. I had a lot of hope as well. I didn't want to go to Capitol Hill for just any random job, but I was asked by staff on the committee if I would do this. And for this specific thing, to investigate the disastrous withdrawal and evacuation from Afghanistan, to investigate why we lost this 20-year war, why the Abbey Gate attack happened, why the Taliban is back in charge, and why Al-Qaeda is now able to gather, and why ISIS-K is now a global threat. I was willing to do that. And Chairman McCall made, private promises to me about how serious the investigation would be. He made public promises as well, repeatedly, about leaving no stone unturned and following the truth wherever it may lay. Unfortunately, the actions did not meet those promises. And I can give a few examples that were extremely problematic. So let me just kind of focus in on the military piece of it, because I could talk at length about how there were State Department witnesses that shouldn't have been brought in, like Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland. We left that on the table. State Department witnesses that we should have treated pretty harshly were largely let off the hook, like Zalmay Khalilzad. But on the military side of things, there were military witnesses that we should have brought in that we never did. There were questions we should have asked that they refused to ask. And then when we did bring in military witnesses, some of them were treated with kid gloves by design and let off the hook. So folks we should have brought in, and I insisted on this for months, really since last year, pretty much since joining. Then we need to bring in General Donahue, General Farrell Sullivan, Rear Admiral Pete Baisley, and other military commanders. But these were the military commanders on the ground. Some of them at the end of the withdrawal, the final piece of the retrograde and the evacuation, some of them just the evacuation. But these were the guys that you need to talk to if you want to get answers about the Haqqani Taliban at the gates of HKIA and why the Taliban refused to go after ISIS-K. If you want to talk about ISIS-K threats and whether there was more that the U.S. could have done in terms of forcing the Taliban to search and raid ISIS-K, whether the U.S. could have and should have been able to carry out airstrikes. Tons of questions for them. The committee refused to make any serious effort to bring them in. There was a refusal to really push CENTCOM on the results of its own internal investigation. CENTCOM was willing to brief Chair McCall and other members of Congress in a classified space. I insisted repeatedly, that's fine, but they need to be questioned in an unclassified space with the transcription so the American people can see what they're being asked and what their answers are. Because one of the things CENTCOM insisted on was that they always insisted the Abbey Gate attack was preventable. CENTCOM expanded that to saying that it actually wouldn't have mattered if Abdul Rahman al-Laghari was sitting behind bars in Parwan prison at Bagram rather than being freed. Even if he had never been freed, they insisted it wouldn't have mattered because ISIS-K would have just used some other bomber. That's extremely fatalistic to me. And it's hugely problematic. I think that anyone with common sense knows that it's easier to prevent an attack from happening if you know that somehow you could have gone back in time and stopped the guy who carried out the attack.
Right.
But CENTCOM insists on that. And that is, and I think that calls into question their analysis and judgment on a lot of the other conclusions that they reach. But the committee refused to really push them on that in any serious way. And then when they did bring in military witnesses like Milley and McKenzie, by design, by a decision of Chairman McCall and the committee, they let them off the hook. Chairman McCall, it was his position that military commanders and generals were not responsible for what had happened in Afghanistan in 2021. He had a phone call with Milley and McKenzie before the hearing where he previewed all of his questions to them, where he fed them potential answers to tough questions, including the tough question to McKenzie about why he turned down the Taliban's offer on the spot in Doha. McCall not only previewed the question, but supplied him with what McCall thought would be a helpful answer to wriggle out of that. He also told them directly that, in his view, they were not responsible for what had happened in Afghanistan in 2021. That responsibility lay elsewhere. And as I kind of laid out to you, I don't think that Milley and McKenzie were the worst actors in 2021. This ultimately goes back to President Biden, to his inner circle, Harris, Blinken, Sullivan, Austin. And the State Department failed in every way they could. The intelligence community failed. But military commanders got things wrong too. We talked about Milley getting the Taliban wrong, getting the Afghan military wrong, McKenzie turning down the Taliban's offer. So by design, Chairman McCall sought to let them off the hook. He told them directly that he didn't hold them responsible. And that really, all of these things really limited what the committee was going to be able to get in terms of getting answers for the Abbey Gate Gold Star families, getting answers for the, thousands of U.S. service members, some of them on their first deployment at HKIA. I know I've become friends with some of them. They want answers as well. And to get answers for everyone that served in Afghanistan for 20 years and the American people. The committee failed, and it failed by design sometimes.
Yeah, it's tough because I know that the ability of people in the Beltway to absolve themselves of blame is a tried and true tradition, and I it disappoints me in a lot of ways because I know that everybody more or less underneath these decision makers are probably in it for the right reasons and are good and honorable people. And I know that everybody that I work with in my, you know, limited experience in the military is incredible. And I mean, they really are the best that we have, but it is a shame that it seems like inevitably, folks who reach these higher levels, they they just compromise themselves in some way. Um, and I don't have a problem necessarily with folks being wrong. I do have a problem with folks not taking responsibility.
Right.
And I think that comes with the job, right? And I mean, obviously, Afghanistan withdrawal is probably one of the most prevalent examples, but man, you can spread this across a great many other decisions that are being made across the way. I mean, yes, everybody's human, but my goodness, is anybody going to raise their hand and take the L? You know, I mean, that's the thing.
You know,
I just
and
don't know.
that's the problem here. And that's why I'm so passionate about it and so disappointed that the committee didn't seek to hold these guys accountable the way that it should have, because we're going to be in another war. I mean, we, we need accountability and answers for how this 20-year war ended. We owe it to Gold Star families, veterans, the American public, but we're also going to be in another war.
Yeah.
And the next war that we're in, it's not going to be against the Taliban. It's probably going to be against a more, serious adversary, Iran, Russia, China, right?
Yeah.
And if we refuse to learn the lessons from this war, if there's not accountability, if there's not lessons learned, I have a real fear that we're not going to be ready for the next war. And the next war, if you're not ready, if you're not prepared, if you haven't learned the lessons from how you lost the last one, there's going to be a lot more Gold Star families. It's going to be more than 13. And that is really where my big problem with the committee is that we let these top military commanders off the hook for the mistakes that they made, mistakes that I think contributed to what happened in August 2021. And if you're not going to hold generals accountable, if you're not going to hold the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff accountable, who are you going to hold accountable?
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. service members on the ground at HKIA, no other military in the world could have pulled off the feats that they pulled off in the horrific situation they were thrown into. But their military commanders were among the people that put them in that position, and there needs to be accountability for that.
I think you stated the case very perfectly well there, man. I couldn't imagine there's anything else I could say that would, you just summed it up perfectly. And, maybe one
I've been
day,
thinking about it. I've been thinking about it for a while, as you can tell.
yeah, man. I think that you just put a nice bow on that. One thing I will ask is what's next for you? I mean, you very publicly resigned, on social media. I got to be honest with you, as someone who's known you for many years, I was both shocked and then not shocked, because I was shocked that it was up there and I hadn't heard you mention it before. But then I realized why you got into this, and also knowing you and knowing the integrity that you have, I actually was not. I was like, no, after I read that letter and I saw the intricate level of detail that you put into that, I was like, nope, this is Jerry to a T, man. Like, I was just like, this makes perfect sense. So obviously it hasn't been that long, but what's next for you? What would you like to see for yourself and for the situation going forward?
I did what I did because I thought it was the right thing to do. And I really did feel like at the end of the day, morally speaking, I didn't feel like I had another choice. I felt like Gold Star families, veteran community, people needed to know that unfortunately this investigation was on purpose, not doing everything that it could to get answers about the withdrawal, the evacuation, the Abbey Gate bombing, and why that 20-year war ended the way that it did. Um, so I really just felt an obligation to do it. It at the end of the day, it was as simple as that. In terms of what I'm doing next, when I said that I was resigning in protest, what I did not mean is that I had perfectly lined up my next cushy gig first, so that I'd resign in protest on Friday and be back at work somewhere nice on Monday. It's not really how I did it. So I'm spending time now really just keeping up public pressure on the committee and sharing what I know and sharing what I know more broadly about the importance of this issue, as there's something of a referendum on it in November. And so I'm sharing what I know about why things went south in Afghanistan in 2021, why we lost this war, and why it's important to learn the lessons from it. And I'm trying to keep the public pressure up on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and Chairman McCall to do the right thing. Because while a lot of time has been wasted, there is still time to start to do the right thing, to start to bring in the people that they need to bring in, to start to ask the tough questions. Ultimately, somebody else is going to have to pick up that torch and carry it on to get all the answers that are needed and to get all the accountability that's needed. But it's not too late for the committee to start to do the right thing. And so that's really what I'm just encouraging them to do, and hoping that, after trying to do it for a year in private behind the scenes, that unfortunately did not move the needle the way it should have. But I hope that, being willing to speak out in public and share what I know, hopefully that moves the needle a bit.